if the dollar is considered by the world's wealth holders to be as good as gold, in other words, is a form in which wealth can be held, then that actually implies that the US is sitting effectively on top of a gold mine. It can keep printing dollars and the world would hold. That makes it very easy for the US to manage its balance of payments, current account deficits by printing dollars so that it does not have to generate unemployment. When a country has a current account deficit, it does one of two things. Either it reduces its aggregate demand, creates unemployment, or alternatively, it actually depreciates the currency. Okay. But the US doesn't have to depreciate any currency. The US does not have to create unemployment. The US can have, in principle, a large enough level of employment without depreciating the currency by simply printing more dollars. And the world's wealthy are willing to hold it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The dollar rules the globe. It's the world's reserve currency. It's the currency in which oil is traded. The power of the dollar sustains US imperialism. But as the world heads towards multipolarity with the rise of China and Russia, an overuse of US sanctions, the rise of alternative trading arrangements that sidestep the dollar, and a very obvious crisis of Western capitalism have led to increasing warnings and even some panic about a decline in dollar hegemony. More and more, we hear the term de-dollarization. But what does this actually mean? And why is it happening? What gives the dollar so much power in the first place? What would a world without dollar hegemony look like? What would it mean for those in the imperial core who benefit from this system? How about those in the third world, on whose backs dollar hegemony is built? And where does the war in Ukraine fit into it all? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Prabhat Patnaik, Marxist economist, professor emeritus at JNU, and author of many books, including A Theory of Imperialism and the more recent Capital and Imperialism, Theory, History, and the Present, both co-authored with Utsa Patnaik. But before we jump into it, this is just the first half of this episode. The second half is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Prabhat, welcome back to the show. It's so nice to have you on again.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so today, of course, we're going to be talking about a topic that you have recently written about and that you comment on quite a bit. And that is, of course, waning dollar hegemony, which is kind of a hot topic right now, especially since the US leadership seems to understand it's actually happening, at least slowly. So let's start with this. I think a lot of people understand or recognize that obviously the US dollar is very powerful. But can you explain, just like in layman's terms, what do we mean when we say dollar hegemony? And how did the dollar become the world's reserve currency?
Well, when you look historically, people wish to have some means in which they would like to hold their wealth. And these means typically should be such that commodity prices in terms of them should not rise too much, because then the value of your wealth in terms of its command over commodities goes down. Now, historically, the kind of medium in which people have held their wealth has been gold, or in some cases, gold and silver. But gold has always been the main form in which wealth has been held, because gold is one which does not require too much space for its value to be held. And secondly, gold is one in terms of which commodity prices are not likely to increase. When commodity prices rise, gold prices also rise. Now, nobody wants to hold their wealth in the form of a currency or a currency-denominated asset unless that currency is in some sense linked to gold. This is the way things were in the gold standard. They were in the Bretton Woods arrangement, which ended in the early 1970s. Now we have a unique situation where the dollar is a currency which plays the same role as gold in the sense that it is as good as gold in people's minds, while it really has no formal gold backing. Now, obviously, the question is, why does it have this role in people's mind of being as good as gold? Essentially because the US is the most powerful capitalist country. Now, if it is the case that actually the US, that commodity prices rose in terms of the dollar, in that case, the US would be able politically and militarily to intervene in any initiative that actually pushes up commodity prices. Therefore, people have this confidence, so that in some sense, the role of the dollar is clearly linked to the hegemony of the dollar is clearly linked to US imperialism. That because it's the world most powerful imperialist country, people expect that its currency is not going to depreciate too much in terms of money.
And I want you to elaborate on that a bit. When we talk about dollar hegemony, one thing that you often note is that it's built on the backs of the people of the third world. And in other words, it's another way of saying that it is in fact a tool of US imperialism. So can you explain, how is dollar hegemony related to US imperialism, and what does it actually mean for the people of the third world?
Okay, the way when you look at manufactured goods prices, they are basically prices which are marked up. In other words, you have a certain labor cost, you have a certain raw material cost, and the actual price is just a markup over that. So if the labor cost and the raw material cost do not change per unit of output, then you would have relative stability of the manufactured goods prices and, in fact, all other non-primary goods prices. If it's not marked up if the raw material and labor costs don't rise in terms of dollars, then the final goods prices also would not rise in terms of dollars. Now, as far as labor costs are concerned, the way that the labor costs are controlled is by having unemployment, by having what Marx had called a reserve army of labor. In fact, you can think in terms of currencies being organized into different categories. The dollar, of course, is the most superior, followed by all kinds of other currencies of advanced countries like the euro and so on, pound sterling, euro, which again are currencies in terms of which wealth is held, but that's because they are supposed to have a fixed price relative to the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
And they maintain this fixed price by adjusting their levels of unemployment. That, if there's a tendency for the currency to depreciate, then they increase the level of unemployment to make sure that the workers are beaten down sufficiently to ensure that there's a price stability. Now, so in the case of the dollar, unemployment has to be relatively less compared to the other countries in order to maintain its relative stability of price. What happens to the unit raw material cost? The unit raw material cost basically depend on a range of primary commodities, that is oil, agricultural primary commodities, minerals of various kinds, and so on. They are the ones in whose case it is possible for the producing countries to come together, as indeed OPEC did, in order to jack up their prices. But that is where US imperialism intervenes to ensure that their prices do not rise. And that's why the military and political clout of the US imperialism is absolutely essential for maintaining the role of the dollar as a reserve currency.
And I mean, yeah, that's the crux of the matter, right? Because at the end of the day, the dollar really is just this piece of paper that has no actual value. And it has no intrinsic value, at least. And it actually costs very little to produce. You just print it on special paper. So to elaborate on that a bit, you mentioned the US military. Like, what is it exactly? It may seem obvious, but what is it exactly? Let's lay it out, that makes the US dollar special, that gives it its value.
Yes, it is true of all currencies that the cost of producing them is much less than the value they command. Okay, and that's because of the fact that their prices earlier in terms of gold were fixed. Under the gold standard, every currency's price in terms of gold was fixed. Under the Bretton Woods system, the price of the dollar in terms of gold was fixed, $35 rounds of gold. Now, and the other currency prices under the Bretton Woods system could vary, but they are more or less fixed to the dollar. So gold provided the basis on which the strength of the dollar uh, was anchored. Now, this is something which actually got a knock because of the fact that so much of the US, you see, if you have the gold being held by people in being considering it to be as good as gold, then effectively it's like the US is sitting on a gold mine. Mm-hmm. It can print dollars which are then held by the world as being as good as gold. As long as nobody says that, look, you please convert it to gold, the US can go on printing as much dollars as it likes. Now, during the Vietnam War and so on, the US actually printed a lot of dollars to finance the war, because of which actually the value of the dollar vis-a-vis gold came under a cloud. De Gaulle was the first person who actually wanted conversion of dollars into gold. The US didn't have that much of gold, and therefore the dollar its convertibility was suspended and the Bretton Woods system collapsed. Now you have a situation where the dollar is not at all convertible to gold. But nonetheless, people still hold the dollar to be as good as gold because, as I said, there's a confidence that its value in terms of commodities is not going to fall too much or not going to fall significantly. And if you hold commodities, there's a carrying cost that basically it will cost you a lot to store commodities. So there's no other commodity that can possibly be as a form of wealth as the dollar is. So given that, the question is that the US has to forever ensure that the value of the dollar in terms of all kinds of commodities does not fall. And it can ensure that by ensuring that the value of the commodities in terms of dollars does not rise too much, which is what happens. Like, for instance, now there's an inflation. This inflation poses a threat to the value of the dollar, which is why the US has raised its interest rates to make sure that unemployment is generated sufficiently so that the workers' wages are kept down even as prices rise, as a means of combating the price rise. Likewise, generating a recession is again a means of keeping raw material prices down. You remember that that oil prices, for instance, OPEC Plus had already cut down its oil output because of the recession, to make sure that oil prices don't fall too much. But because the recession continues, Saudi Arabia has recently decided to further cut its output. So they are cutting their output in order to make sure that the prices don't fall. But the idea of the recession is, and that, by the way, is a challenge to the US, which is declining hegemony. But on the other hand, the recession itself arises because the US is trying to maintain its hegemony of the dollar. Now, normally the recession would not be required because you can use military and political power against any country or group of countries that tries to destabilize the dollar. But now it is not any one country or group of countries, but it's basically the world economy which has caused an inflation to arise, which is why the US has to generate unemployment and reduced prices of primary commodities.
And this also may seem like an obvious question, or the answer to this question may also seem obvious, excuse me, but it's worth breaking it down. Why is the value of the US dollar so important to maintaining US hegemony over the world economy?
No, that's a very important question. You see, as I mentioned, in terms, if the dollar is considered by the world's wealth holders to be as good as gold, in other words, is a form in which wealth can be held, then that actually implies that the US is sitting effectively on top of a gold mine. It can keep printing dollars and the world would hold. That makes it very easy for the US to manage its balance of payments current account deficits by printing dollars so that it does not have to generate unemployment. You know, when a country has a current account deficit, it does one of two things. Either it reduces its aggregate demand, creates unemployment, or alternatively, it actually depreciates the currency. Okay. But the US doesn't have to depreciate any currency. The US does not have to create unemployment. The US can have, in principle, a large enough level of employment without depreciating the currency by simply printing more dollars. And the world's wealthy are willing to hold it. Now, therefore, that is, in general terms, an advantage of the US. But suppose the dollar was not a reserve currency, then the US, if it had to maintain a current account deficit, by the way, I should go back a little here, that typically the leading capitalist country always has a current account deficit vis-a-vis the emerging rival capitalist countries. Britain had a current account deficit vis-a-vis Germany and continental Europe and the United States, which were then emerging as the economic powers, as powerful capitalist countries. If you don't have it, then of course there is no international arrangement. Each country would then repudiate the leadership of the leading country, and therefore the system would break into a series of conflicts between countries instead of accepting a particular order dictated by the leading country. Therefore, typically, to satisfy their ambitions, the US or the leading country always runs a current account deficit. The US has been running a current account deficit for a very long time, vis-a-vis Germany, vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis China, and so on. Now, if you run this current account deficit, then of course you have to finance it. And the way you finance it is by printing more dollars. Suppose the US did not run the current account deficit. Suppose it tried to reduce the current account deficit. And suppose it did so. I mean, either it can do so by creating unemployment, but suppose it did so, let's say, by depreciating the currency. If it tried to depreciate the currency, then the real wages would fall because the value of imported goods would rise relative to money wages. All depreciation hurts the working class. So there would be resistance on the part of the workers because they would be having a reduction in their real wages, and it would destabilize the system. Likewise, if you depreciate your currency to reduce your current account deficit, then other countries are also going to follow suit. Then, because if US reduces its current account deficit, then some other country loses its US market. And if so, then they would try to enlarge the US market by countering the US depreciation by depreciating their own currency. So you would have a free-for-all, what economists call beggar my neighbor policy, that I maintain my level of employment by making my neighbor into a beggar. Okay, so it's beggar my neighbor policy. You'll have a series of beggar my neighbor policies like in the 1930s, and that would mean a collapse of any world order. Therefore, not having to depreciate your currency, not having to reduce your level of employment is something which is very helpful to the US to maintain its leadership role, which it does, and because the dollar is a reserve currency. So it's both ways. The dollar being a reserve currency helps the US to maintain its leadership role as the leading imperialist power. And because it's a leading imperialist power, the dollar is the reserve currency.
And when we talk about dollar hegemony, of course, like you're talking about reserve, so it's in one sense, it's the reserve currency. In another sense, it's what's used to trade. Can you distinguish between the declining use of the dollar in international trade, especially of commodities, which is happening quite fast at the moment, as compared to holding dollars in reserves or as assets, which is happening much more slowly?
Yes, obviously, these two roles are quite distinct roles. except for the fact that ultimately they are related, because if a currency is used for trade, for transactions in the international market, then it stands to reason that it is the form in terms of which wealth would be held, or that or assets denominated in terms of that currency would be the form in which wealth would be held, like US government bonds, for instance, which are in dollar terms. But on the other hand, as you said rightly, it's not a kind of immediate one-to-one correspondence. So if the dollar is not used at all in international transactions, then a time would come when it would no longer be also a form in which wealth is held. But on the other hand, it's perfectly possible that the dollar's use in international transactions would go down much faster, while it would continue to be held as a form of wealth, because people believe that ultimately its value in terms of commodities and so on would not go down.
And then one thing that you actually wrote about recently is the impact of US sanctions on the declining or the waning US dollar hegemony. Can you explain how this imposition of sanctions against countries that the US is hostile to runs this risk of jeopardizing the hegemony of the dollar as the world's reserve currency?
Yes, in fact, you see, if the US was sanctioning only one country, or two countries or something like that, then those countries would actually suffer, they would get isolated. But if the US is sanctioning 50 countries, then it is natural that those countries would in fact come together to form their own arrangements, form bilateral relations. Like, for instance, now Brazil has got a bilateral relation with China. India is having bilateral relations with Russia. These bilateral relations are not new. In fact, they were there before this whole process of globalization began. India had bilateral trade agreements with Russia, with Eastern European countries, all the socialist bloc countries, by which what happened was that you did not need dollars for settling your transactions. Let's say the price of the Indian rupee vis-a-vis the Russian ruble was fixed, or the Soviet Union's ruble was fixed. And therefore, whatever was the trade was done in terms of these uh, these kinds of calculation in terms of local currencies, and whatever was the balance that was left over was settled over a period of time. Suppose India had a positive balance, then over a period of time it will buy more Russian goods in order to settle that balance. So the point is that the bilateral arrangements are not new, but they are coming into vogue precisely because so many countries are actually now under the US sanction. And if that happens, in that case, obviously, they first, of course, form little arrangements about trade. I mean, first you form little arrangements about trade. When you form little arrangements about trade, as you were raising the question earlier, then you would like to hold some of your currency in the form of reserves for future settlement of these trade accounts. So once you have these kinds of arrangements coming up, then the transaction demand for dollar goes down, in which case, over a period of time, not immediately, over a period of time, the wealth demand for dollar would also go down. But that will happen over a period of time, not immediate.
And I think it's important also, you mentioned earlier, and I want to get to some of the alternative arrangements and give more examples of that. But you mentioned earlier, like Saudi Arabia, there does seem to be a shift more recently, not just in sanctioned countries, but also countries that the US has a good relationship with, actually pursuing somewhat independent paths when it comes to their own economic interests. Countries in the global south, like Saudi Arabia or Brazil. I mean, in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's typically this like client state of the US that lately it refused to increase its oil output when the US demanded it. It's, made this deal with Iran overseen by China, which the US was quite upset about. You have also India. I mean, India is a very close ally of the US, yet it's basically buying Russian oil, in many ways keeping the Russian economy like functioning while Russia's under all these sanctions. And the US hasn't been able to stop that. Do you also see perhaps a part of the contribution to a waning dollar hegemony also being related to the fact that we have this like rise in multipolarity where these countries of the third world that aren't necessarily on one side or another, or could even be very close to the US, just, they have more leverage, they have more wiggle room. They don't have to listen to the US as much as they used to. The US, in a way, is like kind of losing a little bit of control over the global South. Does that sound accurate to you?
No, it's absolutely accurate. In fact, that's exactly what is happening, and that is what poses a threat to dollar hegemony and indeed to the preeminent role of US imperialism. You see, in the old days, there was Soviet Union and there was the US, and you had the non-aligned bloc, which was with neither side. It took independent positions on issues. Then for a then for quite some time after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you actually had US hegemony over a lot of countries, including India. I mean, India was a major member of the non-aligned countries, but then subsequently Indian foreign policy came closer to the United States. Uh, but on the other hand, now, once more, because under the new arrangement of globalization, countries like China have come up, grown very rapidly. The Soviet Union, which had built up enormous productive potential, now Russia has inherited a substantial chunk of that productive potential. So you actually now have powerful countries coming up, and that again provides, as you mentioned, multipolarity is what provides a number of third world countries with a degree of leeway, with a degree of leverage, which for a very, very long time they had actually lacked. And the example of Saudi Arabia you mentioned is absolutely a very clear example. You see, let's go back earlier. I mean, fundamentally, the US presides over a world order whose rules it itself flouts. Long ago, in the case of Iran, long ago, in the case of Iran, after the revolution, after the Iranian revolution, they simply froze Iranian assets held in US banks. Now, the point is that if you have an order, if you have an international order, in that case, a country should be free to use the assets it has actually acquired and accumulated in some banks. But they actually froze those assets. They're no longer available to Iran, which is really a grotesque violation of the rules of the game of the very order which they had imposed on the world. Now, for instance, you have a situation where Russians don't have access to the kind of foreign exchange that they held in the European and American banks. Now, therefore, throughout the US is actually flouting its own order, which it imposes on the world. And that's one reason why the world at some point would then say, all right, we are going to put our money elsewhere. And that's a threat to the hegemony of the dollar, which even Janet Yellen has actually acknowledged that, that the sanctions are a threat to the dollar hegemony. But coming back, the Saudi Arabian case is very important because Saudi Arabia, as you said, was all through considered a client state of the United States. But Saudi Arabia, despite Joe Biden himself visiting Saudi Arabia and sending several ministers to Saudi Arabia to ensure that Saudi Arabia does not curtail its oil output, went along with Russia in curtailing its oil output some months back. Therefore, it was a kind of, it took an independent position vis-a-vis the United States against the United States' hegemony, which really must have come as a big shock to the United States. And Saudi Arabia now has just announced a unilateral cut in oil output in order to keep up its price. So the US hegemony is being threatened, and all over the third world, this is making itself felt. As a matter of fact, Seymour Hersh has actually recently pointed out that the majority of the world's countries and the world's population perhaps supports Russia in the war in the Ukraine war, in which Russia is on one side and NATO on the other side. It just shows the kind of loss of hegemony for the United States.
Right. And that, I mean, that can't be overstated too, because typically the US does have hegemony uh over narratives, I would say. And in this case, it doesn't matter what all of these different, US backed outlets or Western outlets say. Countries around the world, for the most part, aren't seeing it the US way. They're not seeing it the pro NATO way. And also, just to mention, I mean, Saudi Arabia has also told China that at some point in the near future they would be willing to sell oil in Chinese currency, which I think the US was also quite upset about. I do want to touch a little bit more on the alternative arrangements that you mentioned. And in a recent piece for NewsClick, which I will, of course, link to in the description, you write, and I'm quoting you, if the sanctions were imposed on just one or two countries, then matters would be different, which is what you were just saying as well. But sanctions these days are used by the US to target dozens of countries. And when this happens, those countries tend to get together to form alternative arrangements for bypassing such sanctions. These alternative arrangements have the effect of undermining the US dominated world order, which is characterized by the hegemony of the dollar. And you did mention a couple of bilateral arrangements. I'm just curious if you could perhaps elaborate and give some other examples of these alternative arrangements. I mean, we also have things like the Shanghai Cooperation Council. I'm not sure how important that is in this context, but also BRICS, which isn't just sanctioned countries, but includes Russia, which is a sanctioned country, as well as China. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of these alternatives, especially as an economy like China is involved, which is massive and growing?
Yes, in fact, I think many countries now want to join BRICS. Saudi Arabia, I'm told, has shown an interest in becoming a member of BRICS, and there is talk of BRICS coming out with a new currency. And actually, many American commentators have said that if BRICS comes out with its own currency, in that case, the hegemony of the dollar, which I said whose undermining would take quite some time, they say would be far more immediate, because people would actually opt to move to the BRICS currency as opposed to the dollar. Whatever that may be, the emergence of BRICS is something which is a very serious challenge to the United States, and particularly, you see, already you have Russia and China in it, but particularly if Saudi Arabia joins, in that case, it would become an extremely powerful grouping. And that would be a real major threat to Western imperialism and particularly NATO.
And, when we talk about like dollar hegemony, at the same time, it does sort of undergird the current world economic system. Do you think that these countries that we're talking about, whether they're targeted with sanctions or whether they're involved in these alternative arrangements, do you think that they're wary of just how much their arrangements could threaten the US dollar? And what I mean here is in the sense that I imagine like countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, even China probably don't want to actually collapse the US dollar overnight. That would have horrible repercussions around the world, would it not?
Yes, absolutely. Particularly because a lot of these countries already hold their assets in terms of dollars. I mean, think of China. It holds a huge amount of US dollars or dollar-denominated US government bonds. So if you have a collapse in the price of the dollar, or even a depreciation in the price of the dollar, in that case, that depreciation would mean that China would be losing quite a bit of its wealth. So they would not like a collapse in the price of the dollar, but they would like a transition, a slow transition from the dollar to whatever currency that they are actually promoting, if there's a BRICS currency. Some American commentators actually say that, look, if you have a depreciation of the price of the dollar, then that is going to generate greater employment in the United States, because that would make imports more expensive, exports cheaper. So the US producers would be able to have a larger share of the market, therefore demand would increase, therefore output would increase, therefore employment. But I think that is something which does not reckon with the fact that such a thing would also mean a reduction in the real wages of American workers if prices increase, and it would also invite retaliations from the US rival. They're not going to sit quietly and watch their markets disappear because the US is expanding the markets that it has access. So, for these reasons, I think a depreciation in the price of the dollar is not something which is, I mean, any significant depreciation in the price of the dollar is not immediately on the agenda, and certainly depreciation in the price of the dollar, not vis-a-vis commodities, that's already happening, and the US is generating unemployment and reduced demand for primary commodities in order to stem that. But depreciation vis-a-vis any other currency is unlikely to, in my view, to be very rapid, precisely for the reasons you mentioned, that already people hold large stocks of dollar or dollar denominated assets. They would not like a collapse in the price of the dollar.
Right. And then I want to talk a little bit about a comparison you've made, which is to how dollar hegemony is similar to colonialism. How does this dollar hegemony specifically
Yes.
benefit the metropolitan capitalist world as a whole while then hurting the third world? And I know you sort of mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but I guess I'm thinking more in the context of, yeah, like how does this have a
Yes.
parallel to colonialism? If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.